two of the brightest celestial objects in our sky. For countless centuries, they have been the focus of art, literature, storytelling, and even worship. The two places which, one day, might serve as a second home for humanity, unless, of course, someone already lives there. According to statements made by several people, that is exactly the case, and that is what we will be discussing today on UFOs Revisited. Joining me are Ron Murphy, Heather Mosier, Katie Page, Micah Hanks, and Mark Matsky. I'm Aaron Deese, and this is The Moon and Mars. So, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but to set the stage for our viewers today, we will be covering a lot of ground in this discussion, literal and proverbial, as it relates to the two celestial objects in question. But I'm curious if we could just very quickly see, does anyone recall when you were first introduced to the idea of life forms on Mars or on the Moon?
So the first thing that I remember, this would have been in the 90s, just flashes of that face on Mars. And I can't even remember what show it would have been, or I feel like it was almost an advertisement, but it was that face on Mars, there's life on Mars, we have definitive proof. But that picture I found out later came out much earlier than the 90s. It's just that for some reason in the 90s, there must have been a show. Does anybody know what show that might have been?
Yeah, Sightings, I think, had that in the title sequence.
Okay.
Perhaps.
Yeah, that might have been it then.
Yeah.
Just seeing that face, and that was the first inclination that I had that maybe there could be life somewhere else.
There's a variation of it in the X-Files opening as well. It's masked as sort of a scream face, but it's alluding to the face on Mars. Yeah.
I mean, I grew up hearing stories about Martians and comic books and coloring books on the Martians on Mars and things like that. So it's been in the consciousness for most of my life.
Yeah, and of course, if we think about H.G. Wells and the other guy named Wells, Orson, and the famous portrayal, by the Mercury Theater, War of the Worlds. Some of our earliest ideas of not only alien visitation, but more importantly, a hostile invasion attempt. I mean, they are Martians that are coming here. And of course, that has sort of remained in people's minds. I mean, even in the early years of UFOs, many of those, researchers, Jacques Vallée and others, had been trying to time the periods at which Mars was closest to the Earth and see if there were correlations with the appearances of UFOs, and could it be that maybe they wait until that distance can be closed a little more efficiently, and that's when we see our sightings waves. So that's kind of remained a focus right on up into the early ufology. Now today we're exploring Mars and we're looking for signs of ancient life there, but it's still a question. I mean, could there have ever been life on Mars? Might it still be there? And could we find some interesting things on our own moon?
Are we the Martians?
Are we the
Martians?
We could be. That's another thing.
Yeah, of course, we can't leave out Marvin the Martian, who was the fourth.
Right.
That's right. And if you can remember, the Flintstones even had that Gizmo guy. Do you remember? So there was hints to extraterrestrial visitation even in the Stone Age.
Yeah. He exhibited signs of high strangeness. He could disappear. Sometimes only Fred could see him.
Absolutely.
There were some high strangeness qualities with our little Martian friends.
And I will make the assertion that he came to advance that particular culture.
Yeah. That's kind of fascinating.
An interesting correlation that just kind of popped into mind for me, Mars has been, as we said at the beginning, a fixture of worship for many civilizations for a very, very long time. Mars is the god of war in the ancient Greek pantheon. And, the idea of a hostile race, a warlike race coming from Mars, of course we know War of the Worlds is a work of fiction. I'm actually surprised that hasn't come up sooner in some of our conversations, because that's a whole thing in and of itself. But this whole idea of a warlike race coming from the planet Mars, the realm of Ares, so to speak, arriving on planet Earth, I think that's an interesting idea.
It's in the name. And predating all of the stories that we've talked about. It's right there in the name itself.
Even the moons of Mars, Phobos and Deimos, is fear and, fear and the other one.
Interesting.
Fear and loathing, that's right.
And is there evidence of a nuclear war on Mars?
Well, and we're actually going to talk about some nuclear aspects to some of this. So thank you, Katie, because you brought us a little bit closer to Earth. Let's go back to the moon for a little bit. The idea of life or even bases on the moon is something that has been talked about quite a bit. And we could argue that this starts with the early moon landings. It has been alleged by former NASA employees that some of the original moon landing tapes were deleted or lost or still being hidden. In fact, and please correct me on this if I'm wrong, but there's an anecdote that the original tapes of the moon landing were accidentally erased in a standard tape erasure procedure at NASA. If that's not correct, someone myth bust me on that, but that's something I've heard repeated several times. In fact, Bob Dean, a United States Army Command Sergeant Major, would allege that additional video does exist of the moon landing that the public has never seen. This is corroborated by former NASA employee and Marine Ken Johnson, who claims that during the landing, Neil Armstrong would switch to the medical channel shortly after stepping onto the surface of the moon and would say the following: "They're here. They're parked on the side of the crater. They're watching us." Now, the book, Dark Fleet, The Secret Nazi Space Program and the Battle for the Solar System, I know, but bear with me, that's the title of the book, which is also by Mr. Len Kasten, whose work we've referenced in another episode of this show, provides an alternative quote for Armstrong, very much along the same lines. This is alleged to have been recorded on the medical channel while they were still in orbit before landing. And the quote is, "These babies are huge, sir, enormous, oh my God, you wouldn't believe it. I'm telling you there are other spacecraft out there lined up on the far side of the crater edge. They're on the moon watching us." Interesting here, because we have kind of a similar statement that they're watching us, allegedly happening at two different times, coming from two different sources, said to originate with Neil Armstrong. What do we think about this?
It's been suggested that Armstrong had a way with words. I mean, he's one giant leap for mankind, right? It's very poetic in the moment. And so people have applied that to those quotes to say, what was he saying was watching? The second quote makes it very clear that there's spacecraft there. But others have said, well, maybe he's just speaking poetically about the size of the moon craters themselves, and that they look like eyes that are watching us. And that's something we've done with the moon historically, right? I mean, the man in the moon. We've looked up there and kind of interpreted what we've seen in, anthropomorphic ways. And maybe that's what he was doing there. Some have suggested. But if it's more than that, then it seems pretty right on the nose. And there was something there that he was reporting.
And as a contrast to that, a recent documentary on Armstrong was released, I believe on Hulu, and it features interviews with former coworkers as well as his children. And they both describe him as being a man of few words, who only spoke when he had something important to say. And I think that's an important aspect of this, if this audio does exist. Does anyone have anything on this audio? Have you heard it, perhaps, if it exists? Do we know anything about Ken Johnson and Bob Dean?
I know Ken Johnson has a book, and he autographed my book, and he said they are out there. So I do know that Ken Johnson actually believes that there is a presence on the moon. But I wanted to make a statement about Apollo 11 and Neil Armstrong and stuff. What gets me every time is on their return from their mission, and they're having their debrief, and they're on their table. You can see every one of them. They were disturbed on some level, like they saw something and they're having to keep a secret, and just their demeanors, they're not like excited to be back or excited about the mission. They look disturbed to me, and that's always resonated with me on some level.
As far as those two names you mentioned, I think the other one, probably Robert O. Dean, i.e. Bob Dean. I recall his very interesting perspectives on things, having some briefing documents about the UFO situation, having gone on to give some testimony, I think, to the Disclosure Project at various times about some of these things. The primary question I have about these, alleged and very explicit references to spacecraft parked on the edge of the crater watching us, if there are explicit mentions of spacecraft, I've wondered what the provenance of those reportings are. To my knowledge, of course, that's never been released. It's always come through whistleblowers who say that there are additional recordings, possibly utilizing the medical channel or something along those lines. On the other hand, if the terminology did not include spacecraft, and it was simply saying they're watching us, like you mentioned, Mark, and some have, posited maybe it was a kind of a eloquent way of saying, boy, she's big, she's looking at us right now, the moon. Possible, it really could be. But whether or not there's direct evidence of there being spacecraft, I do know that there are some really interesting photographs that seem to look like spacecraft-like things on the moon. But whether or not we can say that those are spacecraft is another question. Now, you cannot dispute, in my view, that there are some real anomalies on the moon, and that these have perhaps, fed into some of the questions we have. For instance, you look at crater Aristarchus. Crater Aristarchus has a very interesting anomaly that's been observed for, maybe the better part of the last 2 centuries by astronomers. And what happens is there's a small light that seems to emanate from near the center of Aristarchus, roughly equivalent to the brightness of a star. And this has been seen many times. Now, many would say, okay, what could be reflective enough that would produce something like that, and that predates our space program by so early? But now we've got some pretty high-resolution imagery of crater Aristarchus, and we can see it. The official explanation that they give is the albedo. It's the measure of the reflectiveness in that portion, that region of the center, and maybe also, I would speculate, a degree of silicates that are actually present in the lunar regolith, the lunar soil, that are capable of reflecting light under the right conditions. But there are other strange things that have been observed too. These colorful bands or almost clouds of masses that have been observed by astronomers, and some actually kind of close to Aristarchus. There are what are known as the Blair cuspids, which are a little strange group of objects that cast shadows that Ian Fleming wrote James Bond. Lan Fleming, another analyst with a similar name, and others investigated back in the 1990s. And the list goes on, and we'll get to Mars too, because Mars has its own share of these anomalies. So the question of whether or not truly technological anomalies were observed by the Apollo-era astronauts, I'd have to say, what's the source for that? But I would maintain there are some anomalies on the moon, and some really interesting stuff that I'd love to go up there personally and investigate.
Yeah, and there are a lot of examples that perhaps we can't dive into all of them in detail, but in 2021, a photo was released that looks like some kind of a building. It's often referred to as a hut. It could very easily resemble a small cabin. We have another photo from the book I referenced by Mr. Caston a little while ago that is purported to be a very large, enormous spaceship that has crashed on the surface of the moon. We have another photo that was released in 2015 that's purported to be of a crashed UFO. And of course, all of these have reasonable scientific explanations. Of course, work has been done to debunk them. But as Micah says, there are these repeated and recurring anomalies when we talk about unidentified things on the moon. It's hard to write all of them off as that's a rock, that's a shadow, that's, speaking in layman's terms, I'm not a moon expert.
Look, I've even gone over lunar reconnaissance orbiter imagery myself. I think back when the pandemic was going on and we were all, relegated to our homes and losing our minds. I sat there and went over LRO imagery, and you'll spot some really weird things. Angular features, partially buried, recessed in the regolith. And this is part of the reason why there are a number of scientists who I've spoken with, like astronomer Adam Frank, Jacob Haq-Misra, Ravi Kaparapu, and others. These are mainstream scientists who are saying, we should be applying artificial intelligence and image analysis and image recognition technologies to the lunar surface imagery that the LRO is collecting, and we should see if there isn't something strange up there, because hypothetically, a probe that might burn up during re-entry into Earth's atmosphere might come to rest rather gently in the slightly lesser atmosphere present around the moon. And so it might effectively have served like a big catcher's mitt and collected alien technology that could still be preserved there to this day. No kidding.
Well, we have to go back to Mr. Armstrong again for a moment. He gave a speech at the White House in 1994, and it's a very eloquent, beautiful speech. It takes us back to he very much had a way with words. It was on the 25th anniversary of the Apollo 11 flight, and many of a more conspiratorial mindset, admittedly, have taken the end of this speech as confirmation of what some of these rumors entail. And he said, "To you we say we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers." Now, this very easily could just be about the infinite possibilities of scientific discovery. This is a man who literally stood on the moon. I really like Armstrong. I wanted that quote in here just because it really speaks to the way he looked at life after returning from space. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. But this is something he lived out in his life. In 1976, Mr. Armstrong would accompany explorer Stan Hall on an expedition to the Cueva de los Teos, a massive cave system formation in the Andes Mountains. This place exists. There's a historical society, and you can go see it under the right circumstances. but they were rumored to be looking for a lost underground city which contained these tablets that contained the entire history of humankind and may have been proof of ancient aliens. So, you know, that's a very interesting line. We won't go too much into the ancient alien thing, but I do want to just mention it as to how this one person who is so pivotal in our journey into space is now connected to all of these rumors and stories concerning UFO and alien phenomena.
In fact, I think there's some the moon was brought here. There's on record saying before the moon was here. So I question, the moon itself and what is it? There's some strange anomalies about the moon itself. The craters and how they're all relatively the same depth, and there's not any much variation between that, and it rang like a bell, and the size of the moon and many others.
That's also very accurate. Yeah, I mean, the idea that the moon seems to have a bell-like kind of resonance. And as far as its origin, one of the new leading theories really is that this was the result of an ancient impact, that a piece of the Earth might have broken off. So when we're looking at the moon, as different as it looks, I mean, we are effectively maybe looking at kind of a piece of Mother Earth that remains up there. And really interesting theory is that, and this is speculative, but I mean, it may be that for life to exist on a planet like ours, in addition to having a Goldilocks zone in relative, distance to the nearby host star, or what we call our sun, that we might also have to have a satellite that governs the ebb and the flow of the tides.
Right.
Think about the way that so many organisms on our planet, they literally match their rhythms, their circadian rhythms to the moon cycles. I mean, you see this in so many different ways in nature. So, I mean, we're all kind of attached to the moon in a very literal way. Just read the old book from the 70s by Lyle Watson, Supernature, for more on that. And there are plenty of other studies in recent years, but it's just incredible stuff. So the moon is very much a part of all of us, you might say.
And it's roughly the size of the Pacific Ocean. So if it came from any place, it probably came from that particular region. It is indeed a mirror of who we are, and I think that we mirror ourselves into it as well. It affects us. It's how you become a werewolf, right? So it has it draws things out.
And the tall whites only come on a full moon as well.
Well, we know, I do think it's important to mention as well that Buzz Aldrin has gone on record to refute claims of covered up photos and lost footage and things like that. In the documentary aptly titled Aliens on the Moon, which very much is trying to make the case and doesn't present Mr. Aldrin's remarks in the most neutral tone. But what he said, and this is not taking it out of context, this is what he said. Now, wait a minute. Don't you think the people who designed the camera sent it out as an experiment? When the pictures came back, they looked at them. If there was anything unusual and they didn't find anything. If they had, either we got some people who are scared to talk about it or they're withholding evidence. And that's not what science is about. Science is about informing people what evidence has been found. And that's Buzz Aldrin. And I do think it's important to state implicitly that, Mr. Armstrong's interest in science and archaeology and things are not proof of his belief in alien beings. That's not the point there. But these two very important figures who were the first men to walk on the moon, their take on this, I think, is very significant and important,
Yeah, Buzz, is an interesting character because I've seen in many instances where at times he really challenges the more conspiratorial notions that anything more happened during the moon landings. And yet, you'll sometimes also see the clips like where he was on C-SPAN one morning and he's speaking very eloquently about space exploration. And then all of a sudden he says, on the Martian moon Phobos, there is a monolith there. And you can see it's a very strange monolith. Now, who put that there? Depending on what you believe, maybe God put that there. And he's speaking eloquently, and I'm paraphrasing. But if you actually go and you look at the imagery that we've obtained of Phobos, and it is a peculiar little kind of, oblong kind of potato-shaped moon in orbit around the red planet. He ain't kidding. I mean, there is a large structural kind of looking object that casts a very lengthy shadow, effectively a monolith. Now, what's really peculiar about this is that usually if you have an impact or an object, you would think it would probably come to rest and would, be oriented with its lengthwise side facing down. This object is effectively, taller than it is in wide, and it casts a shadow that is indicative of its height. So imagery that we have obtained of this seems to clearly show that there's not only this tall object casting a lengthy shadow, but that also the way that the light strikes it gives the appearance of, pretty well-hewn sides. It has angular features too, almost like a skyscraper on a Martian moon. So when we come back to the peculiar names of those moons and the derivatives, the meanings there, it is rather interesting. And Armstrong, of course, or Aldrin in this case, Buzz Aldrin, he certainly was aware of that. And although I think he tries to always frame these things in scientific language that plays up the wonder and the spirit of exploration, he certainly acknowledges there's some strange stuff out there that we haven't fully explained.
And what Mr. Aldrin says there, I find idealistic, because he's right. That's not what science does. But what about government science?
Yeah.
Oh, that's true.
Because on the face of it, what he says is absolutely, in a perfect world, the ideal of science would be that we make these discoveries and share the knowledge with everybody. But in all the discussions that we've had so far, I think one bright line between all of them is that that's not how the real world works. And especially when you have governments involved that don't want you to know things, you're not going to know them.
Yeah. And that's the conspiratorial angle that a lot of folks will take with approach, which is, it has a pragmatic backing to it. It makes sense that on some level, if the government were aware of these structures on the moon or on Mars, where we will arrive shortly on our interstellar journey, that they might want to conceal that or at least handle very delicately the way that information gets out. We do have other former NASA employees, such as Dr. John Brandon Berg, who was a NASA employee hired to help look for bases on the moon. Also, Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, would provide quotes at various times about footage that was edited and copied and where he had seen bases in the original footage, which were then removed. We can speculate as to whether or not those things are true, but we do know that there was a governmental interest in the moon beyond just getting someone up there.
Just that we had the idea at one point to test out our nukes on the moon just to see what would happen. It was Project A119. This was in 1958. It kind of just kicked this idea around a little bit because we were also concerned that the Soviets were going to take a hydrogen bomb up. And so they're like, you know what, we'll just do one up. We'll throw a nuclear bomb up there. Sorry, I find this highly amusing. We ended up not doing that though, but the idea was that it would boost morale for the US to see, look what we can do. But then obviously decided against it because for a variety of reasons. One, if we mess up, we're just nuking ourselves if the bomb doesn't make it out. Two, what does that do to the moon? I mean, how delicate is the moon? What would that do to it? And then by proxy, if the moon is destroyed, then what happens to us? But for a brief moment, we had that thought, and we actually had put a team together to talk about the ramifications of that. And Carl Sagan was on that team, I guess. So for a moment in time, we had considered nuking our own moon.
We may not be that far, though, away from that. I mean, I have to say, we just in recent years heard Elon Musk saying maybe we could use a nuclear device on Mars, and that could, start the melting process, right? So, I mean, hey, some, according to them, maybe similar ideas are still on the table, right?
Yeah.
My personal hope is that Operation Bomb the Moon never sees fruition. I will go on record to say that. I hope that's not too polarizing of a statement, but I'm glad that you mentioned Mars because that's an excellent bridge as we move into the rest of this discussion. There are a lot of anomalous things that have been reported from Mars. There are a lot of rumors. We're going to pick apart some of those, but if we're talking about where some of this fascination starts, we can go back over 100 years. On January 4th of 1901, the San Francisco Examiner newspaper would run a headline stating that Nikola Tesla, noted scientist who is well worth his own avenue of discussion. We just don't have time for it today. But Tesla alleged that he had received radio signals from Mars. He was convinced that that is where they were coming from. Now, this may have been embellished on the part of the newspaper. I don't know the exact paper trail of how this headline was brought to light.
I'm pretty sure that, that was as reported. Nikola Tesla seemed to believe that he was potentially picking up on crosstalk, right? Communications, maybe telecommunications used by the Martians. In likelihood, it was probably natural radio emissions produced by the rings of Saturn or something like that, some similar celestial source further out. But he wouldn't have known that at the time that that's what he was detecting. Point is, he had the capability to detect these emissions, obviously of cosmic origin. He felt that these were coming maybe from Mars and that they could be intelligent.
Yeah. The headline, the quote that was listed in the book, some of this reference material comes from the book The Martians by Nick Redfern, which I hope to have on the table but couldn't fit in my backpack. The headline reads, Nikola Tesla has had the first call of the century from a neighboring planet. That's how it starts out. So it's a very sensationalized way of presenting this information to the public. But it shows that we've had this idea, this fascination of communicating with the red planet for over 100 years, in our documented scientific history. I find that interesting.
Yeah, and that was a hot time for Mars. I mean, it really was extremely interesting to the public, even back then, with the type of fiction that was being written, and like telescopes were more available to the normal person, so you would be looking at stuff that was accessible with just something you could set up in your backyard. So that may be why Mars was sort of identified as the likely culprit, as that was just on everybody's mind at the time.
It's a time when pulp fiction and short stories and periodicals were a very big thing.
Yeah.
Major science fiction publications hadn't really been done yet, so a lot of these stories were circulating in very specific niche communities.
Well, that's a good point, because none of that came from a vacuum, right? It had to come from something. And from the very infancy of telescopes, people have been projecting towards Mars, and they've always seen an intelligence there, right? From the canal systems to some astronomers saying that we can actually see things like ants moving around. So from its very beginning of, its nascence of exploration here, we're using telescopes, it was always seen as a planet that had some sort of life on it.
Well, and Heather mentioned earlier, in the early days of this stuff gaining media attention, seeing the face on Mars, that's what it's often referred to as, but it's also referred to as the ruins of Cydonia, which is the region of Mars where it's identified. But it's this large, seemingly human-like face, and some people have said that perhaps this is a connection to ancient Egypt, going back into ancient alien territory. Some have said this is proof that human beings once lived on Mars, which is something else we can continue to talk about. But, it's this striking cultural image that has really kind of cemented this idea at least for my generation. I love the way Heather put that earlier. We do have pictures of the Martian spiders, which are these long-legged, spindly-looking things that there are geological and chemical explanations for, but then, of course, people go the other way and say, well, no, those are obviously pictures of life forms. You're just trying to get us to think that they aren't. And then, of course, the monolith on Phobos. Did I get that right? Yeah, which we talked about a little while ago. And there's a recurring kind of trend on Mars, as on the moon, where we see these odd photographs that have explanations, but that we can't quite write off. People aren't quite willing to accept, the explanations there. And I wonder, this might be something to discuss, I wonder why certain photos would be redacted or edited, but then other photos, which are incredibly striking, like the ruins at Cydonia, would not.
Yeah, at the same time, they come back and, claim it's shadow play or whatnot, but then we have the door, and we have so many pareidolia, kind of silvery, shiny, metallic objects and things like that. So, is it pareidolia? Is it reflective? Is it shadows? Or was there life on Mars?
We know also, we'll get into a little bit more strange territory here, but and this has come up on this show before, but we know that the CIA experimented with things like remote viewing. And apparently a study was done in the 1980s and was transcribed on several pages wherein a remote viewer looked into the past and saw this thriving civilization on Mars, and due to either war or just environmental fallout, wiped themselves out. And that's why we see what today looks like the ruins of canals and some of these ancient structures which are still on the surface. That's a fascinating idea. What do you guys have on that?
Remote viewing, that's a really interesting one, because in truth, I'm kind of on the one hand fascinated with it. I've spoken with Dr. Paul Smith, who literally wrote the handbook on remote viewing and was very involved in some of the remote viewing programs that the government utilized. Whereas, on the other hand, even though I have familiarized myself with some of that literature, I find some of the claims of the remote viewer is pretty out there. A good example, this isn't Mars per se, but yet again, remote viewing either the moon or Mars. If you read the book Penetration, right, Ingo Swann, he is telling this remarkable story of there being this kind of mining operation on the moon, And so as he remote views onto the moon, he can see these men up there, and they're working completely in the nude as part of this lunar mining operation, as you do, right? If I'm going to go mine for helium-3 on the dark side of the moon, I'm going to do it in the nude.
You got to pack light.
Yeah, exactly. And he says, curiously, that while he's observing them remote viewing, that they can see him, and he kind of gets startled because they see him and they start kind of coming toward him. Now, there's some other interesting things in that book, too. I mean, there are these, in fact, a triangle UFO makes an appearance also. This is an individual who absolutely did really work with I guess it was called Project Stargate, but also known by different names over the years, but the actual official government remote viewing programs. Do I necessarily believe that there was really a group of nude lunar mineralogists up there who were involved in some sort of an operation, a mining operation? Come on, guys, you can laugh. It's okay. I don't think so. But I mean, it was.
This is a serious program. I shall have no jokes.
But, I mean, so I'm aware of the literature, and I take those claims with a grain of salt. But that's not to say that remote viewing isn't necessarily always, less than credible. I mean, there have been some very interesting cases involving information that was reportedly obtained that way that seemed to have served a national defense purpose. And again, I've spoken to some of those people who say that, yeah, I mean, it certainly works and can be very useful in that capacity. And I have even spoken to current people who work with the space program who think and have said to me that they think that using remote viewing or something like that might help us to glean some information, not only about other regions of space, but maybe about things like the UFO phenomena.
Mm-hmm. We have at other times talked about the Aurora crash in Texas, which took place at the end of the 18th century, and the narrative in the newspaper that came out at the time stated that the occupant of that craft was from Mars. How that determination was made, I do not know, but that's an even earlier reference to this idea that shows that people were thinking about this. We had this idea. Mm-hmm. Another anomaly that's been identified on Mars that I can't help but bring up is the Dogman on Mars. There is an image that we may be able to use circulating of what appears to be a bipedal wolf-like creature carved into a rock face, or depending on how we interpret it, possibly standing on the rock face. And comparisons have been made to Anubis of ancient Egypt. Once again, the ancient alien possibility. This could very easily be a case of pareidolia, or perhaps werewolves are from Mars. Stay tuned for the next publication. This is Monster Publishing. I don't know. But it takes us into some very bizarre territory, and I think illustrates the way in which speculating along these lines can evolve. And I'm not saying what this particular image is or isn't. I just find it very interesting.
Well, we could use that as an opportunity to go back to the face on Mars for a moment, because if I'm not mistaken, there have been various images taken of that throughout the years, and the better our resolution becomes, the less it looks like a face. Mm-hmm. So I want to make sure, just to state that,
yes,
for the sake of some balance, is that as we get better at resolution and better imaging, it's taken away some of the shadowy and more pixelated aspects of those original images, because people have built entire sort of cosmologies around these anomalies, these Mars anomalies, and I think it's that's human nature to do so. But what do you do when the thing that you've built your whole sort of philosophy around turns out to just probably be a hill?
Yeah.
I mean, that's at work here as well.
Something I found interesting about the moon as well are these Mason ceremonies they had, and the numbers they used on the craft, the number 33. And does that have any significance to what was happening on the moon?
Very well may have. I mean, you see that often in government, and really I think it's just human nature to assign, special significance, see patterns and magic numbers and things like this. Back during the era when there was seemingly this mysterious region, the Cydonia region. And again, there were some NASA engineers, when they originally saw the imagery of the so-called face on Mars, they were compelled by that too. Often, a scientific mystery presents itself, and people say, gosh, could this be what it appears to be? And then further evaluation determines that it's not. But for a time, while there was all that speculation, Richard C. Hoagland and other popular commentators who were looking into this, he was making explicit correlations not only between the appearance of the face and, of course, its sort of Egyptian-like appearance, but also to all these other kinds of corollaries that he found between ancient Egypt and tradition, Hermetic tradition and esotericism and the space program. So There is sort of a degree of that, and I think that it certainly is worthy of noting that I'm certain that some of our astronauts have been members of the Freemasonic order, right, fellow travelers, and again, that's just kind of a tradition, I think, that you see in government, right down to our dollar bill.
So one thing that I wonder if it's worth exploring at all is why is everything Egyptian for us whenever we start looking at things that have significance? I mean, we're referencing Anubis. We're not saying a werewolf necessarily. That still hasn't become the vernacular that we use. We still reference Anubis. We reference, that looks like the Sphinx or the pyramids of Egypt. We're not talking about Mayan pyramids usually. I mean, what is it about Egypt that it fascinates us here on Earth, but also now we've extrapolated that and put it on other planets as well?
I think there's two certain things that come to mind. One is the face originally was believed to have a nemes around it, like an Egyptian pharaoh would wear, and it had a slight resemblance to the Sphinx. That's number one. And also in Egypt at I forget the name of the temple, but there was something that looks like like a helicopter on one of the things. So I think that there was always this notion, about ancient aliens, that if any advanced civilization visited in the past, it would have been Egypt, right? Because they were so, monolithic in what they had done, and how could human beings possibly build a pyramid, right? And then they just assumed, well, it had to come from someplace else, and then they found this kind of smoking gun up there, and I think that is connected.
But further look at the fact that, Egypt just remains truly one of the most iconic, ancient cultures, maybe one of the most iconic cultures ever to have existed. And archaeologically speaking, even though we know an awful lot about the ancient Egyptians, the methods that probably would have been used in the construction of the pyramids, haven't figured it all out. I'm not speaking from a speculative perspective here. I'm very interested in archaeology, and I'm speaking in terms of what conventional mainstream archaeologists would say. There are still a lot of questions about ancient Egypt, still a lot of things we're still trying to wrap up. How this high civilization emerges in a relatively, fast period, a very short amount of time, springs into existence. And look at what they left to us. Of the great wonders of the ancient world, only one remains. And it just so happens that the Great Pyramid, but really all the pyramids of Giza, they're also the oldest of those ancient wonders. The Colossus of Rhodes, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, lost to the dust of time, but the pyramids remain. So I think that's part of that enduring fascination. And of course, yes, we project that from Earth out into space. And we start looking at, the way that we can name our moon landers after gods from the ancient times. Odysseus, that just dropped down on the moon, that wasn't Egyptian, but even still. And of course, the Egyptians and the Greeks had a lot of interface with one another. So we project our mythology onto our spacecraft, onto other planets. And in fact, we've named those planets after our gods. So it makes a lot of sense that Egypt would play into all of that as well.
When was the original photo obtained of the face on Mars?
I feel like that was in I don't know why 76 is sticking in my mind, but I'm pretty sure it's 76.
And very interesting, because if you remember, mid-late 70s, almost the exact same time, what was happening in the United States was King Tut was being exhibited all throughout the museums in the U.S. So it just continues to comment on the fascination with that culture. And you put those things together. And Steve Martin, right? King Tut, he went on Saturday Night Live and sang his song. And this is all playing into, I think, sort of this idea that, King Tut, and look at the sarcophagus, and the face on Mars is like, wow, and just this real excitement, right, I think, was building.
And you also remember there was this almost pseudo-New Age movement putting things under a pyramid shape, it was sharpen a razor blade, all this kind of stuff going on as well too. That was a magical shape. But yeah, I think there's something to be said about that. And I actually remembered. So in Egypt, there's a column there that has what appears to be a helicopter. That's in a place called Lycropolis, which means the city of the wolf.
Interesting. I thought it was so cool. Well, when we see these motifs, they're represented even earlier in some cases in the Sumerian and ancient Mesopotamian literature. Some of the earliest mentions we have of canine-human hybrids come from there. So it's a wonder if perhaps if you do subscribe to the ancient alien theory, it's something, again, that could be talked about at length. You know, perhaps these ideas are coming from space, we're visited to our ancient ancestors, and we've just continued to propagate them in our own terms as we go forward.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's a lot.
We as human beings like to make gods in our own image, right? I think that was just a point. So that if they're in our image, then you could probably kind of work with them in a way. You could talk to them, you could understand why they do the things that they do, because life in reality is kind of chaotic and there's really no explanation for what's going on. So I think immediately you see nature being personified as human. The storms and the weather and all that other kind of stuff. That definitely was happening in Mesopotamia. But the idea that it comes from above, right? That's what it is. So it descends down to us. So in order to understand what the gods want from us, there has to be a necessary transcendence to get up there. And I think that has always stayed with us. That up above us is this world of perfection. That's where the gods live. It's almost unknowable to us. But then you see little hints in stories as well, and in myths, even in the Judaic Bible. Every now and then a chosen one will get an opportunity to go up there into the ether, right? Into that perfection. And I think that really kind of builds not so much on an ancient alien theory, but just the way we think in polarity. We're very structuralistic whenever it comes. If there's problems down here, there might be perfection up there. And I think that's just a statement on human beings.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, when that person comes back, there's a way that you have to interact with them because they've been changed.
They've been changed. That's right. They've been changed. They've had the revelation, right? Or the epiphany in a way as well, too. But yeah, I think that's, you know, you look, even whenever you get the 10 Commandments, you have to ascend up onto a hill. You meet with somebody, and then your whole figure is completely changed.
As we've seen today, the topics of the moon and Mars have a propensity to spawn endless speculation. This may be for a number of reasons, but two things are sure. If there is or ever has been life on either of these celestial bodies, we may very soon have the opportunity to investigate it firsthand. But what we know for sure is that both of these celestial objects illustrate the possibility of what human beings can accomplish.